In the sheet National Pathways input, as part of defining the assessment, users insert their emission scenarios of their country or region under assessment. Please again read the blue and yellow box before starting to use the sheet. And first of all, users can start inserting scenario names up here. I've already inserted CPS here, which is our reference scenario, and I can insert an extra scenario, for example, the NDC scenario. If I click on insert, an extra table is inserted all the way down, where I can insert these emissions. Then the second step is to determine the sectoral emission splits up here. This means that how much of the total emissions of a country or region are part of a certain sector. In this case, I've already inserted the values for the historical emissions. So I've inserted 50% of the total emissions come from electricity and heating, 5% from transport, etc. I assume this will stay the same in our reference scenario, the CPS, but it will change in the alternative scenario. So this is information that should be pulled from an external data source. And again, they can use the worksheet to do calculations for this. So in my alternative scenario, the NDC scenario, the share of electricity-related emissions will decrease, for example, to 40%. Transport could stay the same. Buildings will also decrease. Industry emissions would go up, perhaps. LULUCF would go up, and waste would stay roughly the same. If you click on update, the calculations are updated. And we see that the NDC scenario suddenly accounts for 80% of total emissions for the sectors that we've selected. These sectors correspond to the sectors that you've included in your assessment boundary. So if I would have selected all of them, they would appear all of them here. But I have deselected two, so there are two fields empty. But one might wonder if it makes sense that the other two sectors would account for the remaining 20%, which might be a bit optimistic. So we need to perhaps increase a bit here and there to match the same ratio. And now I've increased it to 85%. The next step is to insert historical data, historical emissions. First, users insert the latest inventory year, so up to which year you have emissions data as historical data. In this case, we have it until 2018, and I've pulled these data from an external source, which I can also store in our worksheet. These blue cells are automatically calculated based on the historical emission splits. And I do the same thing for CPS, but then, of course, until 2018, it's empty, and I need to start filling in from 2019. Again, the yellow cells are data entries, and the blue cells are calculated based on the emission splits given here. So the CPS splits. And also the red cells here, the growth rates of the scenario are calculated automatically based on the splits and the total emissions. Then for the NDC scenario, I have not filled the data yet, but I have stored it in my worksheet. Also from 2019 until 2050. And copy it from there. And I could insert it here. Always remember to paste values only in case you have stored formulas in your data. So now I have inserted my NDC scenario information, and I can click on update, and it calculates the sectoral emissions as shown here in the blue cells, and it shows the sectoral growth rates here. No data entry required for that. And click on Data Check Save. All data has been input correctly. Please proceed. And then in case users want to keep track of other mitigation policies of these scenarios, they can click on this cell and it leads you to a overview where you can keep track of what policies are included in the mitigation scenarios or in your national or regional total emissions. Here CPS and NDC are inserted, so I can use this cell to keep track on what scenario or what emission policies were used in the NDC. For example, policy name would be agriculture down, for example. The scenario would be automatically selected based on the scenarios that you've inserted. So in this case, I would keep track of my NDC scenario. You would give a policy description, target type, could be related to GHG emissions or electricity related. And here I would select agriculture. So as you can see, this is very similar to the actions list overview. And it's meant so that if the policies listed here change, users can quickly identify whether their list of scenarios here is still up to date and whether they should adjust the total emissions down here. It is important to realize that the reference scenario that is inserted here is the one that's used for the impact assessment of sub and non-state actions. That means that for each action, we determine the emissions under target realization and the emissions under a reference scenario. The emissions under a reference scenario are calculated using the growth rates presented here on the sector-specific level. If an action has sector cross-cutting targets, we use the growth rate of the total emissions. For any other sector, for example, an action that is focused on transport, we would use the transport-related growth rates for the reference scenario of this actor. This is rather difficult to understand, perhaps, but please read the methodology note for a more thorough explanation. Then the final functionality of this sheet is that you can select whether the reference scenario is also used as the default growth rate scenario for actors after their year of target realization. So if you click yes, actors would follow a CPS growth rate, in this case, after they have finalized their target. So if a target is, or if an action runs until 2030, for the remaining years of your assessment, the CPS growth rate would be taken, for example, between 2030 and 2050. If you click no, it gives you an option to enter the growth rate scenario that you would like to use instead. So in this case, we only have this 1 second scenario, in this case, the NDC scenario. So this means that after target realization, so after this 2030 target, for example, the actor would follow a NDC growth rate instead of the CPS that's default. We can again click Data Check Save to see if everything is in order. And yes, it is okay. Users can click Reset, which deletes the full NDC scenario table in this case and deletes all entries from the tables. And users can start with a fresh sheet.